You've probably seen the picture. It's famous. On the far left, there's a hunched, ape-like creature. It slowly stands up straighter and straighter across the line of figures. The hair disappears. The brow ridge shrinks. At the far right stands a modern human, holding a briefcase or a spear. The message is clear. We started as primitive brutes and marched steadily forward, getting better and smarter with each step. Evolution as a ladder, a progression from bad to good, from simple to complex, from them to us. And in that picture are all the other hominins. The Neanderthals, the ones we call cavemen. Homo erectus, Lucy. They are just rungs on the ladder we climbed. They are the less evolved versions of us. The failed drafts, the prototypes that had to be scrapped before the final. Perfect model us could be built. It's a simple story, it's an inspiring story, and it's almost completely wrong. The question of whether these other ancient people were just less evolved humans is a good one. It gets to the heart of how we see ourselves. Are we the pinnacle of creation, the inevitable endpoint of a long, straight journey? Or are we something else? Just one branch on a messy, sprawling bush of life, a branch that happened to not get cut off. The real story of our family is much more complex, more interesting, and a lot less tidy than that famous illustration. To start, we need to meet the most famous of our relatives, the Neanderthals. If you say caveman, you're probably picturing a Neanderthal, a brutish, club-wielding, dim-witted thug. Hunched over, grunting, maybe dragging his mate by the hair. This image is a relic. It's a caricature drawn by the first scientists who found their bones over 150 years ago. They saw the thick brow ridge, the powerful bones, the stocky frame, and they projected their own ideas of what primitive must look like. The first skeleton they reconstructed was from an old Neanderthal man riddled with arthritis, which is why they imagined him so stooped and pathetic. The truth is very different. Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis, were a stunningly successful type of human. They weren't a stepping stone to us. They were our cousins. We share a common ancestor who lived in Africa maybe 500,000 years ago. One group of these ancestors eventually gave rise to us, Homo sapiens. Another group left Africa and headed into Europe and Asia. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they adapted to the harsh, cold environment of Ice Age Eurasia. They became Neanderthals. They weren't less evolved. They were differently evolved. Their bodies were a masterclass in adapting to the cold. They were shorter and stockier than us on average. This compact build, like a thermos, is great for conserving heat. Their noses were huge, with a large internal cavity. This wasn't for a better sense of smell. It was probably to warm and humidify the cold, dry air they breathed in before it hit their lungs. Their bones were incredibly dense and strong, suggesting a life of intense physical activity. And what about their brains? That's where the dumb brute idea really falls apart. A Neanderthal's brain was, on average, slightly larger than a modern human's brain. Now, brain size isn't a perfect measure of intelligence. The shape and organization matter more. But it immediately tells you they weren't simple-minded. You don't evolve a massive, energy-hungry brain for no reason. They used that brain to do some remarkable things. They were expert hunters. We know this because we find their stone tools among the bones of giant Ice Age animals like mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant deer. These weren't animals you could kill by just getting lucky. It required planning, cooperation, and courage. They likely used wooden spears with fire-hardened tips or stone spearheads. Given their powerful bodies, they probably used ambush tactics, getting up close to thrust their spears into these massive beasts. It was a dangerous, brutal way to live. Their tools, called Mousterian tools, were not just sharp rocks. They were a significant upgrade from earlier technologies. They would take a large piece of flint, carefully prepare it, and then strike off a perfect flake that was already shaped to be a scraper, a knife, or a spear point. This shows abstract thought. You have to be able to see the tool inside the rock before you make it. They controlled fire, they lived in caves and rock shelters, but also built simple structures out in the open. They took care of each other. We have found Neanderthal skeletons with healed injuries that would have been debilitating. One famous individual, the Old Man of Shanidar in modern-day Iraq, was in his 40s or 50s when he died. He was ancient for that time. He had a crushed eye socket that probably left him partially blind, a withered arm that was useless, and severe arthritis. He could not have survived for years with these injuries unless his group fed him, protected him, and cared for him. This is compassion. This is a complex social bond. They even seem to have had a sense of symbolism, maybe even spirituality. They bury their dead. This might sound simple, but it's a huge leap. It means you don't just leave a body to be eaten by scavengers. You are treating the dead in a special way. At Shanidar Cave, there's evidence that one individual was buried with clumps of flowers. Some scientists debate this, suggesting the pollen could have been brought in by rodents. But at other sites, Neanderthals were carefully placed in graves, sometimes with animal horns or tools. It suggests a ritual, a belief. In Spain, deep inside a cave, scientists found a structure made by Neanderthals 176,000 years ago. They had broken off stalagmites and arranged them into two large rings. They had built fires on them. This was long before Homo sapiens even got to Europe. What was this place for? We have no idea. But it wasn't for shelter, it was deep underground in the dark. It was a special place, built for a purpose we can only guess at. It shows a mind capable of creating meaning and symbolism. So, were they less evolved? They survived and thrived in the brutal cold of Ice Age Europe for over 300,000 years. To put that in perspective, our species, Homo sapiens, has only been around for about 300,000 years in total, and modern civilization is only a few thousand years old. They were not a brief failed experiment, they were one of the most successful human stories ever. But the story doesn't stop with Neanderthals. The world was a lot more crowded back then. For most of human history, there wasn't just one type of human on the planet. There were several living at the same time. Let's go further back in time to meet another relative, Homo erectus. The name means upright man. These weren't our cousins, but more like our direct ancestors or a very close relative of our direct ancestor. And their story is one of incredible endurance. Homo erectus was the first human species to walk fully upright with a body plan much like our own. They were the first to leave Africa in a big way. They appeared on the scene almost 2 million years ago and didn't disappear until maybe a couple 100,000 years ago. Let that sink in. They existed for more than 1.5 million years. They spread from Africa all across Asia to places like Indonesia and China. They weathered countless ice ages and climate shifts. If success in evolution is measured by longevity, Homo erectus might be the most successful human ever. They were pioneers. They invented a new kind of stone tool, the Acheulean hand axe. Unlike the simpler tools before it, a hand axe is a symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tool made from a large stone. It takes skill and foresight to make one. It was the Swiss Army knife of its day, used for butchering animals, cutting wood, and digging for roots. And this design was so good, so effective, that they kept making them in basically the same way for over 1 million years. Homo erectus was probably the first human to harness fire, a game-changing technology. The fire provides warmth, protection from predators, a way to cook food which makes it easier to digest and unlocks more nutrients, and a social focal point. The night was no longer a terrifying dark place, it became a time for gathering, for sharing. Were they less evolved? They were less like us than Neanderthals were. Their brains were smaller, though still much larger than a chimpanzee's. Their technology was simpler. But to call them less evolved is to miss the point. They were perfectly evolved for their world and their time. They were so well adapted that they didn't need to change much for an immense stretch of history. They were not a rung on our ladder. They were a long, thick, and incredibly successful branch on the human family bush. And there were others. The cast of characters keeps growing as we find more fossils and develop new technologies. In a cave in Siberia, scientists found a tiny finger bone and a tooth. They didn't look particularly special. But when they managed to extract DNA from the bone, they got a shock. It didn't belong to a Neanderthal or a modern human. It was a completely different type of human, a new branch of the family. They were named the Denisovans, after the cave where they were found. We know almost nothing about what the Denisovans looked like. We have so few fossils. But we know from their DNA that they were a sister group to the Neanderthals. They split off from the Neanderthal line hundreds of thousands of years ago and populated Asia. They were a ghost lineage, a whole population of humans we never knew existed until genetics gave us a peek into the past. Their story shows us how much we still don't know. There were likely many other types of humans out there whose bones we haven't found yet. Then there's one of the strangest discoveries of all. On the Indonesian island of Flores, researchers found the skeletons of tiny humans who stood only about 3.5 feet tall. Their brains were tiny, about the size of a chimpanzee's, yet they lived alongside giant storks and dwarf elephants, until as recently as 50,000 years ago. They were nicknamed hobbits, and their official name is Homo floresiensis. The best guess is that they were descended from a population of Homo erectus that got stranded on the island millions of years ago. On islands, evolution can do strange things. It's a phenomenon called island dwarfism, where large animals tend to get smaller over generations because of limited resources. These tiny humans, despite their small brains, made stone tools and hunted. They were a bizarre, successful, and completely unique experiment in being human. They prove that the path of human evolution wasn't a one-way street toward bigger brains and bigger bodies. There were side paths, detours, other, equally valid ways of being human. This brings us to the central mistake in that March of Progress picture. Evolution is not a ladder, it's a branching bush. Life doesn't evolve in a straight line towards some predetermined goal. There is no goal, there's no perfection that natural selection is trying to achieve. Evolution is just the process of a population adapting to its immediate local environment. That's it. A polar bear is not more evolved than a grizzly bear. It is exquisitely adapted to life in the Arctic. Its white fur, its thick layer of blubber, its paws that act like snowshoes, all these traits make it a superb Arctic hunter. But if you took that polar bear and dropped it in the forests of North America where the grizzly lives, it would be a clumsy, obvious failure. It would starve. The grizzly bear, in turn, is perfectly adapted for its environment. It's not a less evolved polar bear, it's just a different bear for a different place. The same is true for humans. Neanderthals were the polar bears. They were brilliantly adapted to the cold, rugged landscape of Ice Age Europe. Their powerful bodies were suited for close quarters hunting of massive game. Homo sapiens, our own species, were the grizzly bears. We evolved in the varied climates of Africa. Our bodies were a bit lankier, more suited for endurance running and dealing with heat. Our technology and social structures may have been better suited for a wider range of foods and environments. Calling a Neanderthal less evolved is like calling a polar bear a less evolved grizzly. It's meaningless. They were on a different evolutionary path, shaped by different pressures. They were not a beta version of us. They were a finished product, a different model of human altogether. For hundreds of thousands of years, these different models worked. The world was big enough for a variety of humans. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Eastern Asia, the hobbits on their island in Indonesia. Homo erectus might have still been around in some pockets, and our species, Homo sapiens, was in Africa. Then, about 60,000 years ago, something changed. A large group of our ancestors, modern humans, began to migrate out of Africa. This wasn't the first time Homo sapiens had left Africa, but this time it was different. This time, they succeeded on a massive scale. They spread across the globe. And as they spread, they met their cousins. What happened when a group of our Homo sapiens ancestors, moving into the Middle East, first encountered a group of Neanderthals? For decades, we thought we knew the answer. We replaced them. We were smarter, better, more advanced. We outcompeted them, drove them to extinction, and took their land. It was a story of conquest, of our inherent superiority. But then genetics came along and told a much more intimate and much more shocking story. In the early 2010s, scientists were able to piece together the entire Neanderthal genome from DNA extracted from old bones. Then they compared it to the genomes of people living today. The result was a bombshell. Every person today living outside of sub-Saharan Africa has Neanderthal DNA in their genome. About 1 to 2% of their DNA is from Neanderthals. Think about what that means. It means our ancestors didn't just replace the Neanderthals, they met them, and they had children with them. There was a time, or many times, when a Homo sapiens individual and a Neanderthal individual saw each other as partners, as mates, as people. They had families. Their hybrid children were healthy and fertile enough to be accepted into the human group and have children of their own, passing those Neanderthal genes down through thousands of generations, all the way to us. The same is true for the Denisovans. When scientists sequenced the DNA from that tiny finger bone, they compared it to modern human populations. They found that people in Melanesia and places like Papua New Guinea and Australia carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Many people in East Asia carry a smaller amount. This means that as our ancestors moved through Asia, they met and interbred with the Denisovans too. This interbreeding is perhaps the single most powerful argument against the less evolved idea. You don't see a primitive, subhuman creature and start a family with it. You see another person. Maybe they looked a little different build, different facial features. But they were human enough, they were people. This discovery blurs the lines of what we even call a species. One of the classic definitions of a species is a group of organisms that can breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. By that definition, were we and Neanderthals really separate species, or were we just different populations of the same species, like a Doberman and a Golden Retriever? Scientists still debate the terminology, said some prefer to call them Homo sapiens neanderthalensis and us, Homo sapiens sapiens. But the labels don't matter as much as the reality. We were one big, messy, interconnected human family. The DNA we inherited from them wasn't just junk either. Some of those Neanderthal and Denisovan genes seem to have been helpful. Some are related to the immune system, perhaps giving our ancestors a boost against local diseases in Europe and Asia that their African immune systems had never encountered. A particular Denisovan gene found in modern Tibetans helps them live at high altitudes where the oxygen is thin. Our ancestors met the locals, interbred with them, and picked up useful genetic tricks that had taken those other humans hundreds of thousands of years to evolve. It was an evolutionary shortcut. So if they weren't primitive, if we interbred with them, and if they were so well adapted, why are we the only ones left? Why did all the other kinds of humans disappear? This is one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution. There's no simple answer, and it probably wasn't a single event. It was likely a slow, complicated process that played out over thousands of years, and the reasons were probably different in different places. One major factor was probably climate. The last ice age was not a stable period of cold. The climate was incredibly volatile, swinging wildly from cold and dry to relatively warm and wet, sometimes in the space of a few decades. This would have been hugely disruptive. The Neanderthals were specialists. They were masters of hunting the big game of Ice Age Europe. When the climate changed rapidly, the ecosystems changed with it. The forests and the animals they relied on might have vanished removed. Maybe their specialization became a weakness. Our species, Homo sapiens, might have been more adaptable. We were generalists. Coming out of Africa, we had experience with a wider variety of environments. Our toolkit seems to have been more diverse. We had projectile weapons, like spears that could be thrown, and maybe even the bow and arrow. This is a huge advantage. It lets you hunt from a distance, which is safer and more effective for a wider range of animals, from birds to bison. And Neanderthals seem to have relied on close quarters hunting, a much riskier business. Our social networks might have been different too. Some evidence suggests that Homo sapiens lived in larger groups and maintained long-distance trade and alliance networks. This is a powerful survival mechanism. If your local area is suffering from a drought or a lack of game, you can rely on your connections with groups 100 miles away. Neanderthal groups seem to have been smaller and more isolated. When times got tough, they had no one to fall back on. Then there's the simple fact of numbers. The main wave of modern humans coming out of Africa was likely much, much larger than the existing Neanderthal and Denisovan populations. Even a small competitive advantage, being slightly better at finding food, having slightly more babies survive to adulthood, can have a massive effect over centuries. The Neanderthals might not have been violently wiped out. They might have just been slowly swamped. Outcompeted for resources, their populations shrank and became fragmented until they just couldn't sustain themselves anymore. And part of their disappearance might have been through assimilation. As our larger populations moved in, the smaller Neanderthal groups didn't just vanish. They interbred with us. Maybe over time, their distinctive features just got diluted in the much larger Homo sapiens gene pool. They didn't so much go extinct as get absorbed. Their legacy isn't in their fossils, but in us. They live on in our DNA. So we come back to the beginning. Were they just less evolved humans? No. That's the wrong question based on the wrong idea of how evolution works. They were not failed drafts. They were not primitive stepping stones on a preordained path to us. They were different kinds of humans. They were parallel experiments in humanity. For millions of years, the world had room for many different ways to be human. There was the resilient traveler Homo erectus, the cold weather specialist Neanderthal, the mysterious Denisovan of Asia, the tiny island-dwelling hobbit. Each was a success story in its own right, a unique and valid answer to the question of how to survive and thrive on this planet. The truly strange and unusual situation is the one we live in today. For the last 30,000 years or so, we have been the only humans on Earth. This is a lonely and unprecedented position. For almost the entirety of our family's history, we shared the planet with our cousins. The world was a more human place then, in the sense that there was more human diversity. Seeing them this way changes how we see ourselves. We aren't the peak of evolution, the finished product. We are just the last surviving twig on a once flourishing branch of the tree of life. Our survival wasn't inevitable. It was a product of luck, timing, climate, and a series of small advantages that played out over millennia. We aren't the winners of a grand tournament. We're just the ones who were still standing when the music stopped. The Neanderthals and all the others hold up a mirror to us. They show us that there are other ways of being human. They remind us that our own path is not the only one. They were not lesser. They were just other. And in their story, we can see our own more clearly, not as the masters of the universe, but as one part of a deep and complicated family, lucky to be here at all.